Good morning, everyone. We have the privilege of looking at Parshat Vayakhel, coming back to the story of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and building the Mishkan. After a brief hiatus, just to take a step back, because I think it's just so important to um, express and to understand. There are so many levels of discussion when it comes to looking at the Chumash, at our Parsha. There's obviously the verse by verse component of the Parsha that we look at. There's the Parsha as a whole and the themes that run throughout the Parsha, and often that's sort of captured or not captured um, in the um, in the uh, in the Haftorah, right? It's reflected in the Haftorah. Um, but there's also the broader component of the Parsha, of the book, the story of the book, and what's going on between the Parshiot. And that's a really important component here as well. The second half of the book of Shemot is dedicated to the building of the Mishkan. The first half is all the exodus of Egypt and the redemption of the Jewish people, which I'll include the giving of the Ten Commandments, receiving of the Torah, is the pinnacle of that mountain, as you would, of receiving the Torah. But the second half is the building of the Mishkan. And the building of the Mishkan, the entire component of this second half, is intentionally structured, right? The Torah is trying to communicate something to us based on its unique structure. We have two parshiot, Truma Tetzaveh, that talks about the construction. We have the golden calf story in the middle, and we have the last two parts is Vayakhel Pekude, which is again the continuation of the building of the Mishkan. And in the middle, in between Mishkan, Ego, Mishkan, you have a description or a requirement of Shabbat, right? We have that in Kisisa, and we have the beginning of Vayakhel, right? So the structure is Mishkan, Shabbos, Ego, Shabbos, Mishkan. Truma Tetzaveh, Mishkan, beginning of Kisisa, the mitzvah of Shabbos, the story of the golden calf in the middle. Then we have Shabbos again, Vayakhel, right? Sheshet Yamim, that's what we have at the beginning of Vayakhel. And then the rest of Vayakhel and Pekude is the building of the Mishkan. This structure is what we call a chiastic structure. It comes from the Greek word, the Greek letter chi, which is the X, right? So you have sort of an inverted structure like that. Mishkan, Shabbos, Egel, Shabbos, Mishkan, Tabernacle, Shabbos, Calf, Shabbos, Tabernacle, right? That sort of structure. And that's to teach us something. That's to teach us something. It's supposed to highlight the fact of the structure, tell us there's a relevance here. What is that? So in different settings, it's different things, right? In this setting, I think the message is pretty clear. What's ultimately the difference between the Mishkan and the Egel, between the golden calf and the golden tabernacle? Right? Ultimately, they're very, very similar. They're both physical gold representations for or manifestations of the divine presence. They're trying to capture God in a physical plane, in a physical structure for an infinite God that is finite, that is not finite and cannot be captured in physicality, right?
Well,
They're
one
both
is a fate and the other is not. I mean,
so Chuck's question becomes the question. What's the difference? Why is the golden calf a sin? An arch sin, a great sin, the maybe original sin of the Jewish people, and the tabernacle is a huge mitzvah, a lauded construction project for the Jewish people. What's the difference? What's the difference? Why is one a mitzvah and one a sin?
Because one
So,
was a mitzvah. Because one
oh,
was ended in the
says Lee, I'm going to sharpen it a drop, but I like that. It's sort of a tautology, right? One's a mitzvah, therefore it's a mitzvah. And you're totally right. One of the really interesting features of Vayakhel and Pekude, when we talk about the building of the Mishkan, over and over and over again, when you read it, you will read Asher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. Asher Tziva Hashem Lasot Otam. Asher Tziva. right? Over and over again. They made the thing, Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. Over and over and over and over again. We keep reading this idea, Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe, over and over again, right? And we had that before, Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe, Kasher Tziva V'achoshen Ha'ifod Asher Alav Mimenu Maseh Yeh, Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. Vayasem Oto al Katef Ha'ifod. They put the ephod on his shoulders. Kasher Tziva Hashem Moshe. Vayaset HaChoshen. They made the Choshen. Tchelet Argaman. All of these different things. They put them on. Kasher Tziva Hashem and Moshe. Kasher Tziva Hashem and Moshe. Over and over and over again. Says Lee, and this is also the idea of the Beis HaLevi. Ultimately, the difference between the Mishkan and the Egel is the divine command. Ultimately, and this is a very interesting sort of halachic, hashkafic, sort of a theory of legal precedent. What makes something good or bad? God's command. Are things inherently good or inherently bad? No. If God tells us to do it, then that inherently, that manifestation of the Ratzon Hashem, of God, is what makes it good, right? You don't have to necessarily say that. You could say God commands us to do something because it's good, right? This is a famous philosophical difference or question. Does God command us to do things because they're good, or are they good because God commanded us to do it? Right? That's a big question that comes up in philosophy and sort of legal theory. But in our case, ultimately, what distinguishes between the Mishkan and the Egel is that God commanded us to do that. Now you can ask, is that because it was good? Is that because of this? I don't want to get into that right now. That's Lee's answer. I want to give a more technical answer. Yeah, Chuck, you have a question?
No, I mean, we're also commanded not to make idols. I mean, it's so you're dealing now right now with just the positive commandment.
Meaning, what does God tell us to do? God tells us to build a Mishkan. God tells us to build an ark. The ark is supposed to have kruvim on it. How is that not an idol? Because God told us to do it.
But we're also commanded not to build idols. I mean,
You're right. You're right. But this isn't an idol. How do we know it's not an idol? How do we know it's in the service of God? Because God told us to.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that because when they built the Egel Zahav, that was, I mean, we see that as an idol, but since we're not commanded specifically not to build the Egel Zahav,
we're commanded to build, we're commanded not to make any idols. Right? We're commanded not to make any graven images. So the Egel Zahav is a huge sin. How is the Aron not a huge sin? Because God commanded us to make it. God told us exactly how to make it.
But that's not but that's not an idol. I mean, that's.
You're right. So that's the answer. So ultimately, the defining difference is going to be the role of Tzivoy Hashem, of God's command. That's one option. The other option, or a parallel option, I would say, is this idea of Shabbos. One of the important differences between the Egel Azav and the Mishkan is the idea of Shabbos. And we see that deployed structurally, linearly, literarily, right? The way we laid that outline. Mishkan, Shabbos, Egel, Shabbos, Mishkan, right? The Shabbos is literally the brackets between the golden calf, telling us that the difference may be between one and the other is Shabbos. What does Shabbos represent? Shabbos represents a moment where we take a step back from our work and we remember that everything we're doing is a means to an end, not an end in itself, right? It's a means towards serving God, towards creating, remembering the brit, the covenant between God and the Creator, and that everything we do is about furthering God's will in the world. That nothing that we do, all the work that we do, is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And ultimately, I think that's part of the unique connection between the Mishkan and Shabbat, right? How do we know what we're not allowed to do on Shabbat?
39
Exactly. The 39 creative labors, where do those come from?
building Mishkan.
Those are all the activities that they had to stop doing when they were building the Mishkan, meaning literally Shabbos interrupted the Mishkan's work. And not just because practically one overlaid the other, but they were defined in opposition to each other. Anything you did to build the Mishkan, you had to stop when it came to Shabbos. Meaning Shabbos was the check in the Mishkan to make sure that the Mishkan was not going to be turned into a golden calf, but a means to connecting to God, something even greater than the Mishkan. And that perhaps is the core difference. Shabbos is the reminder, is the check on the Mishkan and anything that we do to make sure that our focus is on building that relationship with God and not using the Mishkan, not using the golden calf as the intermediary, as the crutch to sort of worshiping God through those golden objects.
So if they had built the Egel Zahav, but otherwise didn't dance around it, didn't worship it, it's a piece of art to put on someone's, well, if they didn't have it in the tents, but to put on someone's mantle, that would be okay, yes?
I'm not saying it'd be okay. I mean, meaning, yeah, if they didn't build the golden calf and use it as a substitute for God, I don't even mean as an idol,
It's a
right?
piece
They're
of art.
different, but then, I mean, then it wouldn't be the golden calf. Meaning the whole point of the golden calf, whatever the storyline is, either it was a substitute for God or it was a substitute for Moshe. It was their way in which they felt was the only way they could reach God, or it was an intermediary to reach God. All of those were mistaken positions where they thought that the golden calf was their target. Hold on a second. I'm sorry, I'm going to resume. Let's add more fuel to the fire before we answer it. One of the positions are, what do the Kruvim look like? They're not angelic baby faces. They are faces of calves.
Of
Calves of cows, baby
Oh,
cows,
okay.
calves. Right?
I don't know, where did
Right.
it come from?
What?
How do we know that?
How do we know that?
Yeah.
It's based on, if you look at the place where we see Kruvim used in Tanakh, if you do a simple search, you'll see that Kruvim is one of the places where we have a very deep definition, impression, vision of God's chariot is in, sorry?
In Ezekiel, you mean?
Yeah. So there are times where the Kruvim are described as, hold on, I'll just read it to you.
4 faces.
As 4 faces.
I was just changing the ear.
The Kruv, one of the faces then.
Hey, Dolores, how are you?
Here, I'll give you an example. Sorry. I'm just waiting for my Safari to load. So if you look at Yecheskel 10:14, there are 4 faces to these Kruvim. Pnei ha'achad, pnei ha'kruv. The first face is the face of a kruv. What's a kruv? We don't know. Pnei ha'sheni. I'm sorry. Upnei ha'sheni, pnei adam. And the second one is the face of a person. Upnei ha'shlishi, or v'ha'shlishi, pnei aryeh. And the third is the face of a lion. V'ha'revi'i. And the fourth one, pnei nesher, is the face of a eagle. Now, there's another time where we start reading through what all these faces are, and we are told that there are 4 faces. What are the 4 faces? An eagle, a human, a lion, and an ox. It seems like Kruv and ox are interchangeable here.
Okay, I see.
Send it to you.
Shehem, and Rashi says that explicitly on this verse. This is 10:14. Ve'em hayu pnei hashur. This is the face of the shore. She nehafchu lekruv. That was the kruv, right? And that is, where's the shore come in over here? Hold on. Tell you the exact chapter, the exact pasuk. So what are these like math problems, right? Which one is? So in 110, in the first chapter, in the first revelation of the face of the Kruvim, we are told, so I'm waiting for Safari to load. Utzmut pneihem, and their faces were, their four faces. Pnei Adam, the face of a man. Pnei Aryeh, face of a lion. And then the third side is Pnei Shor, is the face of an ox. And then the fourth side is Pnei Nesher, the face of an eagle. So says Rashi, says many other people, Kruv from chapter 10 is clearly a description of chapter 1. So Rashi says it was a Kruv that turned into an ox, right? Others say no, a Kruv is the ox, right? So some will take this to mean that when we say Kruvim in the Mishkan, when we say Kruvim over here, we mean the face of an ox. All of this is getting to one important point, right? Lee, you ask, aren't we commanded not to make a graven image? And how is this so different, right? So two things. One is, this is where God's command comes in, right? Where it's the command that sort of differentiates this. This is where there's maybe a deeper meaning to that, what I was just saying about Shabbat. That Shabbos reminds us that it's not so much the image that's a problem, but it's how it's being used, right? Is this a tool to serve God, and we're remembering that? Or is it, God forbid, Ela Elohecha Yisrael? This is the substitute for how you serve God, where they really believed that the golden calf was the substitute for actual God, or the connection to God. Doesn't matter. But I would say a very technical answer that you could also think about is we have the concept of ase doche lo tase, that there are general commands, but then we can get a positive, there's a general negative command, but we can get a positive mitzvah, which will tell us to override it in a very specific, narrow situation. So I'll give you an example. Am I allowed to marry my sister-in-law when she's no longer married to my brother? Am I allowed to marry my sister-in-law? The answer is no. Am I allowed to marry her if my brother dies and she has no children? Maybe there's a mitzvah, right? It's called yibum. Am I allowed to wear shatnez? The answer is no. Am I supposed to wear shatnez in my tzitzis, in a linen garment with wool tchelet, because that is what's supposed to be worn for the tchelet, in a full, proper pair of tzitzis? Yes. Am I allowed to wear shatnez? No. Does the Kohen Gadol or the regular Kohanim have to wear shatnez because their clothing are shatnez when it comes to serving in the temple? Yes. How can they do that? We have a concept called ase doche lo taseh. So the positive mitzvah overrides the negative mitzvah in certain contexts.
So let's take it a little bit further. In certainly reform, but say conservative movement, you will have people driving to shul because it's a positive commandment to be in shul, say on Shabbat. On the other hand, they have to do that.
No, so it's asi doche lo taseh isn't that wide. Asi doche lo taseh is when I could say, listen, I want people to, have matzah, but the matzah is chametz, so no, it's not that wide. And they don't even claim that. Asi doche lo taseh is very, very specific, narrow situation in the where a biblical command expressly tells you have to do one, and by inherently requires you to violate the other. So and even that, you have to sort of figure out what's the principle, what's the core factor for that, right? It's not like a total, not a total thing. The fact that I could live close to the shul, I don't need to drive to shul on Shabbos, is enough to tell you this is not aseh doche lo taseh.
Is this the principle behind, say, grama devices?
No,
that's different.
Grama devices, meaning like indirect?
Yeah.
No, none of you wouldn't be allowed to violate Shabbos for like a general thing like that. I'll give you an example of an aseh doche lo taseh. You're allowed to slaughter the korban of the tamid on Shabbos Because the only way to bring the Tamid offering on Shabbos is to slaughter it on Shabbos, right? And it has to be that the obligation is simultaneously fulfilled, right, with the negative prohibition. Meaning the slaughtering is itself part of the mitzvah of bringing it. So, for example, to slaughter an offering, the slaughtering of the offering is itself part of the sacrificing the offering. So the mitzvah, the negative commandment is violated as you fulfill the biblical command, right? That's not true on the flip side. So, for example, I'm sorry, not if it's delayed. So, for example, there's a biblical mitzvah to take the aravot, the long, tall branches, and put them on the mizbeach in the temple, right? It's one of the mitzvot of Sukkot, but that gets cut before Shabbos because I don't need to cut the aravot. That's not part of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is just putting it on the mizbeach. If I prepare before Shabbos, I wouldn't need to cut it on Shabbos.
And if you forget?
What?
If you forget to cut it before Shabbat?
So the Gemara deals with all of those situations, but you can't just go cut them on Shabbos.
Okay.
Anyways, all right. Let us continue. So what I did want to look at today is the mitzvah of the lechem hapanim, right? That's our point of departure. The table. We read in our Parsha this week, we will read of the building of the shulchan, of the table. And the question is, what's the role of the table? What's the point of the shulchan? And it's not just a random question. It's actually a question that, at least according to the Rambam writes in his Moreh Nevuchim, in Moreh Nevuchim 3:45. And I'm reading to you sort of in the English only because the Hebrew translation of it is, the Moreh wasn't written in Hebrew. It was written in Arabic. So to read a translation into Hebrew and then translating it to Hebrew to English makes no sense. I'm just going to read to you in English, in the English translation, which is just as much a translation as the Hebrew. So he writes, the use of the altar for the incense and the use of the altar for the burnt offering, i.e. the inside altar and outside altar, and their kalim is obvious. And their utensils is obvious. It's obvious why we have those altars. Why do we have those altars? To bring sacrifices on, right? And for the Rambam, by the way, one of the main points of the Mishkan is to bring sacrifices, right? This is the Rambam who counts the mitzvah to build the Mishkan and the mitzvah to build the temple as a mitzvah, livnot, buy it, to build a house, liot makrivim korbanos, to bring the sacrifices. So much so that the Rambam doesn't even count a separate mitzvah to build the altar, because the whole point of the Mishkan is to bring sacrifices. And the Rambam has a rule. Any mitzvah that's a general mitzvah, the subcategories of those mitzvah are all one mitzvah. Everyone has to figure out, the Rambam is really interested in counting 613 mitzvah. Everyone agrees there's 613 mitzvot. Just people don't agree. What are they? Why? Part of that is a question of how do you describe what are the rules for it to be a mitzvah, right? Is it a mitzvah to build the Mishkan as a whole? Is it a mitzvah to build each one of the kalim? What about each one of the sockets of the Mishkan, right? We have each pillar. All of those are commanded from God. So is that one mitzvah? Is that 10 mitzvah? Is each side a mitzvah? What are the mitzvah? So the Rambam sets rules. The Rambam says anything that's a general command, all the subsumed mitzvot are included. So the Mishkan is a place to bring sacrifices. So all the kalim, all of the pieces that go into building the Mishkan, being a place to sacrifice korbanot, that's all one mitzvah. Right? So the Rambam writes that's all one mitzvah. There's no separate mitzvah to build an altar. And build an altar. I will contrast that for a moment with the Ramban, Nachmanides. If you recall, 2 weeks ago, we saw the Ramban's position. The Ramban thinks that the whole point of building the Mishkan is to be a mobile Har Sinai, to continue the revelation that happened at Sinai, so that the Kvod Hashem, the glory of God, can rest within the people. Says the Ramban, says Nachmanides, if that's the purpose, I don't understand the Rambam. Why doesn't the Rambam write that there's a mitzvah to build an altar? Bringing sacrifices to God is a separate goal of the Mishkan. And so he writes a commentary on the Rambam 613 mitzvot that he titles very boldly, the mitzvot the Rambam forgot. The mitzvot the Rambam forgot. And one of those mitzvot is a mitzvah to build the altar. Why? The answer is obvious. For the Ramban, the goal of the Mishkan is a place to have God's presence. A side point of that is that you could then sacrifice there. For the Rambam, the whole point of the Mishkan is to have God's presence there so you can sacrifice it. And so the Rambam doesn't count them, right? That's just, again, all of this is to bring us back to the Moreh. The Moreh says the purpose for the altar, the purpose for the incense, that makes sense. But the object of the table, the shulchan, with the lechem apanim on it, with the showbread on it, to be placed upon it continuously, tamid, always, up to this day, I have not been able to assign any reason for this commandment. The Rambam doesn't know, why do we have the shulchan? What role does it play in the Mishkan? Right? That's pretty big words for the Rambam, right? Ad hayom lo matzati lama liyachis oto. What's the reason for it? Why do we connect it? What's the point of having it in the Mishkan? Right? That's what the Rambam says. So the question is, what's the point? What's the role of the shulchan? What's the role of the table? What's the role of the lechem apanim?
I had seemed to remember learning at one point that it was a symbol of partnership with man and God in creation, of creating something, because it's not something that you're just pulling off of a tree or rooting up from the ground. It's something that requires a creation from the plant and then additional creative activity by man to make it into lechem.
Gotcha. And therefore, and that's the bread, not the table.
Bread, right.
So in general, that's true with bread in general. Bread is a unique sort of combo piece where we recognize the role we have in it and God has in it, right? That might be why, for example, chametz is never allowed in the temple, right? Chametz represents sort of the human role in it, and the temple is supposed to be a place where we highlight we recognize God's all-powering, all-shining role in our lives. That's one option, right? That might be why on Shavuot we bring a sacrifice of bread, right? Because Shavuot is the holiday of the Torah, which is all about our human initiative to partner with God. Maybe that's part of it. And that's in general, even the Hamotzi Lachem Min Haaretz bracha that we make is a reminder to us every time we make it. On the one hand, of course, humans had a huge role in bringing bread forth. But we also remember that our role is dwarfed compared to the Almighty's substantive preparation and providing for us. That's why we say Hamotzi Lachem Min Haaretz, God who brings bread from the ground. Did God bring bread from the ground? I had a role in that. I kneaded it. I baked it. I let it rise, right? But we're highlighting that. So that might be part of it. But we'll come back to that. There are three approaches that I think we can think about here, right? And they're sort of logical before we even give names to it. Either the point of this can be the table, and there's some symbolism that the table represents, or it can be the bread, and there's some symbolism that the bread represents. And if you're going to have bread, you need to have a table. Or the point of this can be sort of the experience around the table, right? You can have a table, you can have bread, but there's another facet of that, sort of the simulation of a meal, right? And if you think about what is sort of the Kodak moment, the freeze frame of what the Shulchan is all about, it'll start to tell us some things about what's the point or what's the reason behind having them there. So let's start with the first one. The whole point of the shulchan is to have the table, right? And if you're going to have a table, it's silly not to have a table with bread, right? This is the position of the Medrash Rabbah and the others as well, that the point of this is just to help like stage. It's almost like a staging for the Mishkan. So God doesn't need a table. God doesn't need chairs. God doesn't need food. Doesn't need anything. The whole point of building the Mishkan stemmed from a need for humans to build a place where they can envision God to rest. And if you're doing that, so you need to build a table, and you need to have a menorah for light, and you need to have, an inner and an outer place, right? All of these are models of not just sort of human models of building a relationship, but let's then add, we have a king. We have to glorify the king. It has to be a really nice space. Everything should be gold and gilded and replete with all the different things that a king would need, right? And by the way, according to this position, this is the Abarbanel says this as well, why do the Kohanim eat the bread at the end of the week? Right? Once the bread's over, it's eaten afterwards. It's to highlight that all the bread there was only symbolic. God doesn't need the food, right? So when the food is done, meaning when the show is over, we want to make a show of the fact that it was just a show. No one should think that God, secretly eats the bread, right? You know that story about like the poor man who comes to the Aron and he davens, he needs challahs, and there's someone who says, "Oh, I want to do something for God. I'm making loaves of bread," and he sticks it every Friday into the Aron Kodesh. And then the poor man comes in the afternoon and he's davening to Hashem, "I don't have any food for Shabbos," and he opens the Aron and the loaves of bread. And then the first guy comes back for Kolat Shabbat and he sees the loaves of bread are God, and he goes, "Oh, God had a meal today." Right? It's a beautiful mashal. It's this story, this Hasidic story. Has anyone ever heard it? I totally botched it. I was saying very quick. You never heard it? There's this story of this guy. He wants to like do something for Hashem. And so he and his wife bake 12 loaves of bread. And they put it in the ark. And he leaves. And then there's another guy in town who comes, his wife and him, they're so poor, they don't have any flour even to make challahs. And he's davening to Hashem, and as he's davening, he feels that like his prayers he's davening for bread, he's davening for challah, for Shabbos. He doesn't need anything else, just some bread. And his prayers are so real that he feels like he can smell the bread coming from the Holy of Holies. He opens it up, and lo and behold, there's loaves for his whole family. So he takes it, he brings it home. The first guy comes back from Mincha, and he sees the loaves are gone. God ate the bread. He comes home, tells his wife, "It's amazing. God ate the bread." They do it again the next week, and the same thing unfolds. And finally, the first guy's wife says, "There's no way God's eating the bread. God doesn't eat the bread." And so she hides out in the attic of the shul, looking down, and she watched the scene unfold where this other guy comes and takes the bread. And he comes, I don't remember what the punchline is. She comes, he tells her husband, "You're right, God ate the bread." He shared it with other people. I don't know, whatever. Anyways, the point of this is we don't want people to get the wrong idea that God's eating the bread. Says the Barbanel, we eat the loaves after the week to highlight the fact that God doesn't really need the loaves. It's given back to people. And it can't be eaten by regular people because it's Kodesh. It was in the Holy of Holies. So we give it to the Kohanim, and we make a whole story that people are eating it. Why? So that no one thinks that it should be eaten. That's not eaten, because God doesn't need it. All of this is for us. It's for us to remember, to know the fact that this is sort of the illusion of the Mishkan, to welcome God's presence there, right? That's one perspective of this. The other perspective, we sort of are short on time, so I'm going to run through. This is what Rashi says in a bunch of places. It's not the table, it's the bread. It highlights the fact that God provides material blessings to the world, always. And we're reminded of that, right? That all of this represents sort of God providing to the world. And of course, you need, the lachem apanim, the bread represents sort of the God's substance to the world. And why is it replaced every Shabbos? Because we're reminded every Shabbos that God is the true creator of the world. It's sort of like the mun. The mun reminds us that all of our substance comes from God. And so just like on Shabbos, they would not collect the mun. So on Shabbos, they would replace the loaves of bread to highlight the fact that they're not replacing the loaves of bread. Even the break, the 6 and 6, as opposed to the 12 stacked high, is a simulation of the week. Each 6 days, you could.
Then why not just put the bread down, stacking it on the floor? I mean, then why is a table need that level?
No, because the table, you're not going to put something in the temple that's going to be on the floor. That's disgusting.
They could set aside, they could have set aside a part of the floor that nobody treads on.
No, that's disgusting. You don't put things on the floor. I could set aside from tables and park. You don't put things on the floor. They made it's still the temple. It's still God's palace. They made a place where they're going to leave it's not that the table's not important, but the table serves a role to enable the bread to be there.
It's just utilitarian then.
As opposed to what we said before, the whole point of having the bread is because you're going to have a table. You're going to have a table, you're not going to put bread on it. It's going to look weird. So if the whole point is that you're putting a display case to sort of simulate a house for God, so of course you're going to put tables there. The last position, which I thought, Lee, you were alluding to, but it's a more unique, it's a more recent position, is written in a journal called Migadim, which is for more contemporary biblical thinkers like Rav Yochanan and others. So he writes, it's not about the bread, it's not about the table, it's about the dialogue. It's about represents sort of a manifestation of the relationship, the eternal covenant between God and the Jewish people, the dialogue between them. And tables represent that. Tables represent a place where people would come together to seal a covenant, right? Tables is sort of the celebratory meal after the covenant that the covenant is forged over. It's sort of the home table which everyone can sit around. So it's not the table, it's not the bread, it's the experience. And that's why on Shabbos we switch it also, because that's the day we remember not just the Brit Sinai, not just the covenant from Sinai and the exodus from Egypt, but also the Brit that is predicated on God being the creator of the world. The Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim and Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, and the fact that God's the true creator as well. And so maybe that's part of it. All of that being said, there's a lot more to talk about this. Unfortunately, both our kashrut discussion at the beginning and our other ones sort of cut us a little short, and I have to run, unfortunately, today. So we're going to stop here, and we'll continue some of this discussion next week, because next week we're also talking about the Mishkan. I'm so excited. I'll see you all later.
Okay, thank
I have
you.
a question for you, Rabbi, before you run, if you have a second. We have